High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter storms can kill in minutes, 17-year-old Marcus Chen hammered the final nail into what his neighbors called the dumbest roof in Summit County. The other mountain families had laughed at his bizarre curved design, his strange materials, his city boy ideas that made no sense to folks who'd survived these peaks for generations. But Marcus wasn't just any city boy. He was the son of a structural engineer who died in a building collapse overseas, a tragedy that taught Marcus everything about what happens when roofs fail under pressure. While his neighbors built the same way their grandfathers had, Marcus quietly incorporated techniques he'd learned from studying disasters around the world. Now Hurricane Helena was bearing down on their isolated valley with unprecedented fury. The weather service was calling it a 1,000-year storm. Already, emergency crews couldn't reach them, phone lines were down, and one by one the century-old cabins were succumbing to the relentless assault of wind and ice. But how did a teenager's stupid roof design become the difference between survival and catastrophe? The story began 3 months earlier, when Marcus first arrived in Pine Ridge Valley carrying nothing but a duffel bag and his father's engineering notebooks. His Aunt Sarah had reluctantly taken him in after the accident in Bangladesh, where his father had been consulting on a hospital project when the roof collapsed during monsoon season. "You'll like it here," she'd said, though her voice carried doubt. "It's quiet, simple, good for healing." Marcus had inherited the old cabin from a great-uncle he'd never met, a one-room structure with a traditional peaked roof that leaked in 3 places. While other kids his age were working summer jobs or preparing for senior year, Marcus spent his days studying the failed roof lines around the valley, making notes in his father's precise handwriting style. The locals were friendly enough, but their amusement was poorly concealed when Marcus started sketching curved designs and talking about wind load distribution. Bill Hendricks, whose family had lived in the valley for 4 generations, chuckled openly when Marcus explained his plans at the general store. "Son, that's not how we do things up here," Bill had said, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "These roofs have stood for 100 years. They'll stand for 100 more." But Marcus had seen too many 100-year roofs fail when faced with unprecedented conditions. His father's notebooks were filled with case studies from around the world, typhoons in the Philippines that destroyed traditional structures while newer aerodynamic designs survived, ice storms in Canada that collapsed peaked roofs while curved ones shed the weight naturally. The design Marcus implemented wasn't just curved. It was a complex dome structure that distributed weight evenly while allowing wind to flow over rather than against the surface. He'd reinforced the frame with a carbon fiber composite his father had been experimenting with and installed a drainage system based on Roman aqueduct principles. The construction took him 6 weeks. Each day, neighbors would stop by to offer unsolicited advice or shake their heads at his methods. Mrs. Patterson, who lived closest to Marcus, brought him sandwiches and stories about her grandfather's original cabin roof that had never needed replacement. "You're overcomplicating things, dear," she'd say, watching him carefully calibrate the curve angles. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Marcus never argued. He'd simply nod politely and return to his calculations, checking and rechecking the stress distribution formulas his father had taught him. In his mind, he could still hear his father's voice. "Engineers don't build for normal conditions, Marcus. We build for the impossible day that becomes possible." That impossible day announced itself on a Tuesday morning in September when the Weather Service issued their first warnings about Hurricane Helena. The storm had formed unusually far north and was tracking directly toward the Colorado Rockies with wind speeds that shouldn't have been possible at that altitude. By Wednesday, the entire valley was in emergency preparation mode. Families secured loose items, stocked up on supplies, and checked their generators. The older residents had weathered countless storms and approached this one with their usual mixture of caution and confidence. Marcus spent Wednesday double-checking his roof's anchor points and clearing the drainage channels he'd built into the design. Mrs. Patterson stopped by that evening, worry creasing her weathered face. "Radio says this might be the big one," she said. You sure that contraption of yours will hold? Marcus looked up at his curved roof, its unusual silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Wind was already beginning to whistle through the trees, carrying the scent of approaching weather. It's designed for conditions worse than this, he said, though his stomach tightened as he spoke. Theory and reality were different things. His father had learned that lesson fatally. Thursday morning brought the first real taste of Helena's power, and by noon, Marcus understood why they called it a 1,000-year storm. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ridgemont's main street as Maya Chen stepped out of her battered pickup truck, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. She'd driven through the night from Denver, her truck bed loaded with unconventional materials that would raise more than a few eyebrows in this traditional community. "You're the engineer from the city?" Harold Brennan, the project foreman, emerged from the construction trailer with a clipboard in one hand and doubt written across his weathered face. Behind him, a crew of local workers paused their morning preparations to get a look at the newcomer. "That's right, Maya Chen." She extended her hand, which Harold shook with obvious reluctance. "I'm here about the foundation work." Harold's eyes drifted to her truck, taking in the unusual cargo. "Those your materials? Looks like you brought a load of garbage instead of proper building supplies." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "It's a composite foundation system, recycled materials combined with traditional methods to create structures that can flex with seismic activity and extreme weather." "Flex?" Harold let out a short laugh. "Miss, we build things to last up here. Rock and timber, steel and concrete. That's what survives mountain winters." Several workers had gathered closer now, their expressions ranging from curious to openly dismissive. Maya recognized the look. She'd seen it in academic conferences, grant committee meetings, and every professional gathering where her age and unconventional ideas made her an easy target. "With respect, Mr. Brennan, I've studied the geological surveys for this area. You're building on unstable soil with a history of washouts. Traditional foundations won't hold when the next big storm hits." "Next big storm?" An older worker stepped forward, his voice gruff with irritation. "Lady, we've been building in these mountains for 3 generations. My grandfather put up houses that are still standing, and he didn't need any fancy college theories to do it." Maya pulled a rolled set of plans from her truck. "I'm not dismissing traditional methods. I'm trying to improve on them. Look, the climate data shows storms are getting more intense. The foundation design I'm proposing uses flexible anchoring systems that—" "Flexible foundations," Harold interrupted, shaking his head. "Never heard anything so ridiculous. Foundations are supposed to be solid, not flexible." "But that's exactly the problem," Maya pressed on, spreading her blueprints across the truck's tailgate. "Rigid structures fail catastrophically. When they break completely. A flexible system can absorb stress and collapse the first time someone slams a door too hard," another worker called out, earning chuckles from the group. Maya bit back her frustration. She'd encountered resistance before, but something about this felt different. These weren't just skeptical academics. These were people whose lives depended on the buildings they constructed. Their skepticism came from genuine concern, even if it was misguided. "Tell you what," Harold said, his tone suggesting he was being generous. "You can observe the construction process, maybe learn something about how real building gets done. But we're sticking to proven methods. This community needs homes, not experiments." As the crew dispersed to begin their work, Maya stood alone beside her truck, watching them lay out traditional foundation forms. She understood their position. She was an outsider proposing radical changes to methods that had served them for decades. But she also knew what the geological data revealed, what the climate projections predicted. The weather station reports she'd studied during the drive up were troubling. A massive storm system was developing in the Pacific, something potentially unprecedented in its intensity. If her calculations were correct, it would hit the region within the next few days. She spent the morning observing the crew's work, noting the rigid concrete forms, the standard rebar placement, the conventional drainage systems. Everything built to resist force rather than redirect it. Everything designed for yesterday's weather patterns rather than tomorrow's realities. During lunch break, she approached Harold one more time. What if I could prove the system works? Build a small demonstration model? Harold looked up from his sandwich, his expression weary. Miss Chen, I admire your enthusiasm, but we're on a tight schedule here. These families need to be in their homes before winter really sets in. That's exactly why this matters, Maya said, glancing at the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. Mr. Brennan, I think that storm is going to arrive sooner than anyone expects. And when it does, the construction method you choose today could mean the difference between these families having homes to live in or debris to clean up. Harold followed her gaze skyward, his expression growing troubled as he noticed the ominous cloud formation building in the distance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Maya hammered the final wooden peg into place. Her hands were raw and blistered, but the small structure stood complete, a modest cabin that looked nothing like the imposing stone and concrete buildings surrounding it. Where others had used rigid foundations, she had created something that seemed to breathe with the mountain itself. Still playing with your little toy house? It's called adaptive engineering, Maya replied, running her palm along one of the flexible bamboo joints that connected the wooden frame. Traditional structures fight against natural forces. This one moves with them. Derek's laugh was sharp and humorless. You can dress it up with fancy words all you want, but that thing won't last through the first real storm. The town council was right to reject your proposal for the new school. The rejection still stung. Maya had spent weeks developing plans for a revolutionary building design that could withstand the mountain's notorious weather patterns, only to be dismissed as an idealistic outsider who didn't understand real construction. The contract had gone to Derek's firm instead, their design following the same rigid principles that had led to 3 building collapses in the past decade. Time will tell, Maya said simply, though her jaw clenched with frustration. As Derek walked away, shaking his head and muttering about naive city kids, Maya's neighbor Elias emerged from his garden with a basket of early tomatoes. The elderly man had been the only resident to show genuine interest in her work, often bringing her coffee and asking thoughtful questions about her techniques. Don't mind him, Elias said, setting the basket down and examining the cabin's unusual joint system. Some folks are so afraid of being wrong that they can't recognize when someone else might be right. Maya appreciated his kindness, but she could see the doubt even in his weathered eyes. The whole town viewed her as a well-intentioned dreamer at best, a dangerous amateur at worst. Her credentials from the urban engineering program meant nothing here, where generations of families had built and rebuilt using methods passed down through decades. My grandfather used to tell stories about the old Shoshone settlements, Elias continued, tracing the flexible connection points with his finger. Said they built structures that could bend like grass in the wind. Of course, nobody paid much attention to old Indian techniques back then. Something in his tone made Maya look up. Back when? Before the great storm of 1952. Elias's expression grew distant. Winds like you've never seen, rain that fell sideways for 3 days straight, wiped out half the town. That's when they started building everything heavy and solid, thinking they could just muscle their way through whatever nature threw at them. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. And the old techniques? Lost with the people who remembered them. Elias picked up one of her tools, examining the specialized joints she'd developed to allow for maximum flexibility while maintaining structural integrity. Until now, maybe. That's unusual, Elias muttered. Weather Service doesn't usually send teams up here unless... His words were cut off by the sharp wail of the town's emergency siren, a sound Maya had heard only during monthly tests. This time, it carried an urgency that made her stomach drop. The siren was joined by others from the valley below, creating a cascade of warnings that echoed off the mountain walls. Within minutes, people began emerging from buildings. Their faces turned skyward toward clouds that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The morning's clear sky was rapidly darkening, and Maya could feel the atmospheric pressure dropping like a stone. Her ears popped, and the hair on her arms stood on end. "Jesus," Elias whispered, backing toward his house. "I haven't felt air like this since—" The first gust of wind hit them like a physical blow, strong enough to rattle windows and send loose debris skittering across the ground. Maya instinctively reached out to steady her cabin, expecting to find it swaying dangerously. Instead, the structure absorbed the impact with an almost organic grace, its joints flexing and redistributing the force through the entire frame. Around them, the town's solid buildings stood rigid and unmoved, their massive foundations and reinforced walls presenting an uncompromising face to the approaching storm. They looked powerful and permanent, everything Maya's humble cabin was not. But as another gust struck, stronger than the first, Maya noticed something that made her blood run cold. Hairline cracks were already appearing in the concrete foundations of the nearest building, spreading like spiderwebs as the structure fought against forces it couldn't bend to accommodate. The morning after the town meeting, Maya found herself standing at the edge of the construction site where the Hendersons were supposed to break ground on their new home. Instead of the usual bustle of workers and machinery, only silence greeted her. A hand-painted sign had been erected overnight, construction halted by order of Pine Ridge Building Authority. She kicked at a loose stone, watching it skitter across the marked foundation lines. 3 months of planning, convincing, and preparation had evaporated in a single evening. The rejection stung worse than she'd expected, not because of wounded pride, but because of what it meant for the families who would suffer when the storms came. "Figured I'd find you here." Maya turned to see Tom Henderson approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him walked his wife Sarah, carrying a thermos and wearing the kind of determined expression that Maya had learned meant trouble for anyone standing in her way. "I'm sorry, Tom. I thought I could make them understand." "Understand what? That you're trying to save our stubborn hides?" Sarah interrupted, unscrewing the thermos cap. Steam rose in the crisp morning air, carrying the scent of strong coffee. "Don't you dare apologize for being the only person in this town with sense enough to see what's coming." Tom nodded toward the halted construction site. "We've been talking all night. Sarah and we've lived through 3 major storms in our 40 years here. Each one's been worse than the last, and each time we've been lucky. But luck runs out. The building authority can't stop us from building on our own land if we use approved methods," Sarah added, pouring coffee into 3 cups she'd brought. "Question is, are you willing to teach us your techniques unofficially?" Maya accepted the warm cup gratefully, her mind racing. "You're talking about going against the whole town council. Frank Morrison made it clear last night that anyone who helps me will face consequences." "Let him try." Tom's voice carried the quiet steel of a man who'd spent decades carving a living from unforgiving mountain soil. "I didn't fight in 2 wars and build a business from nothing to be intimidated by Frank Morrison's political games." As they spoke, the sound of footsteps on gravel drew their attention. A small group was approaching, the Yamadas from the shop, old Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, and surprisingly Deputy Rodriguez, who was supposed to be enforcing the construction halt. "Heard you might be having an unofficial building seminar," Mrs. Chen said with a sly grin. "Purely educational, of course." Deputy Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not here in any official capacity, just a concerned citizen wanting to learn about alternative construction methods." Maya felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. This could get all of you in serious trouble. Morrison wasn't bluffing about consequences. "Some things are worth the risk," Kenji Yamada said quietly. "My grandfather survived the great earthquake in Japan because someone had the wisdom to build differently, even when others mocked him. I recognize wisdom when I see it, even if it comes wrapped in unfamiliar methods." Over the next hour, Maya found herself explaining her techniques to an increasingly engaged audience. She demonstrated how the flexible framework could absorb and redirect force rather than resist it, how the strategic placement of support beams could distribute stress across the entire structure, and how the seemingly chaotic arrangement of materials actually followed precise mathematical principles. "It's like Aikido," Rodriguez observed, watching Maya bend a small wooden model without breaking it. "My sensei always taught us to blend with force rather than meet it head-on." Exactly. Maya's excitement grew as she saw understanding dawn in their faces. Traditional building methods assume you can create something stronger than nature. My approach accepts that nature will always be stronger, so we work with it instead of against it. The demonstration was interrupted by the roar of approaching engines. A convoy of trucks was climbing the mountain road, moving faster than the usual tourist traffic. Through binoculars Tom had fetched from his truck, they could see the vehicles bore the logos of major construction companies from the valley below. "That's Morrison's answer," Sarah said grimly. "He's bringing in outside contractors for the big developments he's planning. Probably promised them they could start as soon as he gets rid of the troublemaker." Maya watched the trucks disappear around a bend, heading toward the proposed resort site near the peak. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about rejecting her building methods, it was about clearing the way for development that would put hundreds of people at risk when the inevitable storms struck. "We need to move fast," she said, turning back to the group. "If they're bringing in outside crews, they'll want to silence any opposition quickly. Once construction starts on those big projects, it'll be almost impossible to stop them." Tom nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'd better get to work." Elena found Marcus at the construction site, his weathered hands running along the curved wall they'd completed the day before. The structure looked alien against the familiar backdrop of Pine Ridge's traditional timber homes, its smooth earthen surface flowing like water frozen in time. "They think we've lost our minds," Elena said, watching another family load their belongings across the valley. Marcus didn't look up from his work. "Maybe we have. But madness and wisdom often wear the same face." He pressed his palm against the wall, feeling for imperfections. "My grandmother used to say that the mountain doesn't fight the wind, it learns to dance with it." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Sheriff Garrett strode toward them, his face grim, followed by three men Elena recognized as the town council. Behind them walked Dr. Sarah Chen, the meteorologist who'd arrived 2 days ago with her team of specialists. "Marcus!" Sheriff Garrett called out, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "We need to talk." The group gathered in a loose circle around the strange, curved structure. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. Her usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "The latest satellite data is unprecedented," she began, her voice barely steady. "This storm system has characteristics we've never recorded. Wind speeds are projected to exceed 200 miles per hour in the mountain corridors. The pressure differentials—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Pine Ridge sits directly in the path of what can only be described as a meteorological anomaly." Councilman Torres, a man who'd lived in Pine Ridge for 60 years, shook his head slowly. "In plain English, Doc, the storm will destroy everything in its path. Traditional structures won't survive. We're recommending immediate evacuation of the entire valley." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Complete evacuation meant abandoning not just homes, but the community itself. Most families lacked the resources to rebuild elsewhere. Pine Ridge would become another ghost town, scattered across the map like seeds in a hurricane. "How long do we have?" Sheriff Garrett asked. 36 hours until the outer bands arrive. Maybe 48 until the worst hits." Marcus had remained silent throughout the exchange, his weathered face unreadable. Now he stepped forward, placing both hands on the curved wall behind him. "This will hold," he said quietly. Dr. Chen's eyebrows shot up. "I'm sorry. What?" "This structure. It will hold against your storm." The meteorologist looked at the earthen dome with obvious skepticism. "Sir, I appreciate your craftsmanship, but we're talking about forces that will level concrete buildings. This appears to be made of mud and straw. Adobe, rebar, and engineered curves, Marcus corrected. But yes, essentially earth and plant fiber, the same materials that have sheltered people for thousands of years. Councilman Torres snorted. Marcus, this isn't the time for your experiments. People's lives are at stake. Exactly why we can't abandon what might be our only real shelter. Marcus walked the perimeter of the structure, his hand trailing along the wall. Modern buildings are rigid. They fight the wind until they break. This breathes with the storm. Have been tested by time, Marcus finished. Pueblo structures 1,000 years old still stand in the southwest. Syrian beehive houses weather sandstorms that would flatten a shopping mall. Helena watched the exchange with growing understanding. Marcus wasn't just building shelter, he was offering the community a choice between ancient wisdom and modern assumptions. Even if this one building could survive, Sheriff Garrett said, it's not large enough for the whole town. Marcus smiled for the first time that morning. Then we build more. The technique is simple once you understand the principles. Curved walls, reinforced earth, structures that work with natural forces instead of against them. In 36 hours? Dr. Chen asked incredulously. The frames can be erected in hours. The community working together. Marcus looked around the circle of faces. It's possible. Helena stepped closer to the group. What choice do we really have? Evacuation means losing everything. At least this gives us a chance to stay, to keep Pine Ridge alive. The silence stretched long enough for the wind to pick up, whistling through the pine trees with an ominous note that made everyone look toward the darkening sky. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. I'll need to examine the structural engineering more closely. Run some calculations. Sheriff Garrett nodded slowly. And I'll need volunteers, lots of them. Marcus was already reaching for his tools. Then we'd better get started. The emergency town meeting convened in the community center as sheets of rain hammered the metal roof like gunfire. Maya sat in the back row, her notebook clutched against her chest, watching the faces of people who had dismissed her for months. Now those same faces were etched with fear as weather reports painted an increasingly dire picture. The storm system is intensifying faster than predicted, announced Sheriff Crawford, his weathered hands gripping the podium. We're looking at sustained winds of 90 miles per hour by midnight, with gusts potentially reaching 120. The evacuation order stands. A chorus of protests erupted from the crowd. These were people whose families had lived here for generations, whose livelihoods were carved into the mountainside itself. Where exactly are we supposed to go? Called out Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store. The main road's already washing out, and the mountain pass won't hold in this wind. Crawford's silence was answer enough. Maya had driven the winding mountain road that morning and seen the chunks of asphalt already crumbling into the ravine below. The community was effectively trapped. What about the shelter protocol? Asked Tom Martinez, who ran the hardware store. We've weathered storms before. Not like this one. Dr. Sarah Chen, the town's physician, stood up from the front row. I've been monitoring the weather data. This isn't just wind and rain. We're looking at potential structural failures. Most of our buildings weren't designed for Category 4 hurricane force winds. Maya's pulse quickened. She thought of her small house on the ridge, its unconventional design mocked by contractors and neighbors alike. The curved walls, the deep-set foundation, the unusual roof angles, all of it born from her study of structures that had survived centuries of extreme weather in other parts of the world. The community center might hold, continued Dr. Chen, but if the power goes out and we lose heat, we're looking at hypothermia risks, especially for the elderly and children. Old Frank Kozlov raised a gnarled hand from his wheelchair. What about that strange house up on the ridge? The one the girl built? Every head in the room turned toward Maya. She felt her cheeks burn as dozens of eyes focused on her, many still skeptical despite their desperate circumstances. You mean Maya's place? Tom Martinez's voice carried a note of derision. That experimental thing? It's not even properly rectangular. Neither are trees, Frank shot back. And they've been standing through storms a lot longer than our houses. Sheriff Crawford looked directly at Maya for the first time since she'd arrived in Pine Ridge 8 months ago. Maya, isn't it? Could your house accommodate people? Maya stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Public speaking had never been her strength, but the urgency of the situation overrode her anxiety. It could shelter maybe 30 people comfortably, more if necessary. The design is based on traditional storm-resistant architecture from coastal regions and earthquake zones. The curved walls deflect wind rather than fighting it, and the foundation goes down 12 feet into bedrock. 12 feet? Tom's eyebrows shot up. The building code only requires 4. The building code, Maya said quietly, was written for normal weather. Dr. Chen leaned forward. What about power and heat? Solar battery backup system and a wood-burning stove with enough fuel for several days. The windows are impact-resistant and the whole structure is designed to flex rather than break. Maya paused, looking around the room. I know it looks unconventional, but every element serves a purpose. The room erupted in heated discussion. Some voices raised in consideration, others in continued skepticism. Maya caught fragments of arguments. Desperate times, better than nothing. Crazy design, what if she's right? The room fell silent. Sheriff Crawford's radio crackled to life. Sheriff, we've got reports of roof damage on Maple Street, and the Miller's trailer just lost its entire back wall. Wind's picking up fast. Crawford looked around the room, his decision crystallizing in real time. How long would it take to get people up to your place, Maya? Maya's mind raced through logistics. 20 minutes for most people, maybe longer for those who need assistance. But we'd need to go soon, before the road becomes impassable. And you're confident the structure will hold? Maya thought of all the calculations, all the research, all the sleepless nights spent designing something that could withstand the mountain's fury. She thought of the ridicule, the building inspector's reluctant approval, the contractor's head-shaking disbelief. Yes, she said simply. It will hold. Outside, the storm roared its challenge against the mountain, and Maya felt the weight of 37 lives settling onto her shoulders like snow. The emergency council meeting convened in the town hall as the first fat raindrops began spattering against the windows. Maya watched from the back corner, her arms crossed, as Mayor Henderson called for order. The room buzzed with nervous energy. 23 of Pine Ridge's most influential residents crammed into folding chairs, their faces etched with worry. The Weather Service confirms it, Henderson announced, his voice cutting through the murmur. Category 5 storm, unprecedented for this region. Wind speeds approaching 140 miles per hour with rainfall estimates of 12 to 15 inches in 6 hours. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Maya had seen storms before, but nothing like what the meteorologists were predicting. The satellite images she'd glimpsed on her phone looked like a cosmic buzzsaw aimed directly at their valley. Evacuation protocols are already in motion, continued Fire Chief Rodriguez. We're opening the elementary school as a shelter, and we've contacted county emergency services for additional support. What about the old mining tunnels? Called out Mrs. Patterson, the librarian. Couldn't we use those? Rodriguez shook his head grimly. Structural integrity is questionable. We can't risk a collapse with civilians inside. Maya shifted uncomfortably as the debate continued. She'd walked past the elementary school that morning, a solid brick building from the 1960s, but with large windows and a flat roof that would be vulnerable to the kind of winds they were expecting. The mining tunnels were equally problematic, honeycombed with decades of water damage and unstable support beams. There has to be something else, pressed Dr. Yates, the town's only physician. The school won't hold everyone, and with this kind of storm, we're looking at potential casualties. That's when Tom Brennan stood up from the front row, his weathered face set with determination. Maya's heart sank as she recognized the look in his eyes, the same stubborn certainty that had driven him to reject her construction methods for months. Is another option," Tom said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "The Morrison house." A ripple of confusion passed through the gathering. The Morrison place was the old Victorian mansion on Elm Street, built in 1892 and standing empty for the past 3 years since Eleanor Morrison had passed away. Maya knew the house well. She'd often admired its ornate gingerbread trim and wraparound porch during her evening walks. "Tom, that place is over a century old," objected Henderson. "The foundation alone—" "The foundation is solid," Tom interrupted. "Built on bedrock with limestone blocks 3 feet thick. And that basement, it's practically a bunker. Stone walls, multiple support columns, and it's already weathered dozens of storms." Maya found herself nodding despite her reservations about Tom's judgment. The Morrison house was indeed built like a fortress, constructed during an era when buildings were designed to last centuries rather than decades. But it was also a single structure trying to shelter a community of over 200 people. "Even if the basement could hold everyone," said Rodriguez, "we're talking about breaking into private property. The Morrison estate is still tied up in probate." "Eleanor Morrison loved this town," Tom shot back. "She'd want us to use her house if it meant saving lives." The debate continued for another 20 minutes, with various factions arguing for different approaches. Some wanted to stick with the elementary school and hope for the best. Others pushed for the mining tunnels despite the risks. A few suggested attempting to evacuate the entire town to Pine Valley, 30 miles east, though the roads would likely be impassable within hours. Maya listened to it all with growing frustration. They were debating locations without considering the fundamental structural challenges any shelter would face. The Morrison house might have thick walls and a solid foundation, but it had never been tested against winds of this magnitude. The elementary school was built to modern codes, but lacked the mass and protection needed for a storm of this intensity. As the arguments grew more heated, Maya realized she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her mother had always taught her that knowledge carried responsibility, and right now she possessed knowledge that could save lives, even if these people had spent months dismissing her expertise. She stood up slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. The conversation died away as Tom Brennan's expression darkened with obvious displeasure. "If I may," Maya said, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. "I've been listening to your options, and I think you're missing something important." "This is a closed meeting," Tom said curtly, "for residents and property owners only." "She's been living here for 8 months, Dr. Yates interjected. "I'd say that qualifies." Henderson nodded reluctantly. "Go ahead, Miss Chen, but please be brief." Maya took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes could determine whether Pine Ridge survived the night intact, or became another cautionary tale about communities that ignored wisdom simply because it came from unexpected sources. The wind had teeth now, razor-sharp and hungry, tearing at anything not anchored to bedrock. Maya pressed herself against the exterior wall of her shelter, feeling the structure flex and breathe with each gust, but it held. Around her, the sounds of destruction painted a terrifying picture: the crash of falling trees, the metallic screech of roof panels being peeled away like can lids, and worst of all, the human cries for help carried on the howling air. She'd been monitoring the storm's approach through her weather radio until the antenna snapped 20 minutes ago. The last report she'd heard made her blood freeze: sustained winds of 130 miles per hour with gusts approaching 160. This wasn't just the storm of the century. It was rewriting the meteorological textbooks in real time. Through the reinforced window, she caught glimpses of her neighbors' homes. The Hendersons' colonial, built to code just 5 years ago, had lost its entire second story. Mrs. Chen's Victorian, a town landmark for over a century, was folding in on itself like a house of cards. But most shocking of all was seeing Bill Morrison's fortress, the concrete and steel monstrosity he'd spent a fortune building, listing at a dangerous angle, its foundation cracked and compromised by the shifting ground. A flash of movement caught her eye. Someone was out there, fighting through the storm. Maya wiped condensation from the window and squinted through the driving rain. It was Tom Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson, carrying what looked like a bundle of blankets. He was struggling toward her shelter, using trees and debris as windbreaks, but the final 50 yards offered no protection at all. Maya didn't hesitate. She grabbed the emergency rope she'd anchored inside the entrance and tied it around her waist. The moment she cracked open the door, the wind tried to rip it from its hinges, but her flexible design allowed it to bend without breaking. She fought her way outside, paying out rope as she went. Tom saw her coming and tried to shout something, but the wind stole his words. As she got closer, Maya realized the bundle in his arms wasn't blankets. It was his grandmother, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. The old woman's house had collapsed with her inside. Getting back to the shelter took every ounce of strength Maya possessed. The wind seemed determined to claim them all, lifting her feet off the ground more than once. But the rope held, and finally they tumbled through her doorway into the relative calm of the shelter's interior. Tom was sobbing, whether from relief or fear, Maya couldn't tell. Mrs. Chen was breathing but unresponsive, a nasty gash across her forehead still seeping blood. Maya grabbed her first aid kit and went to work, cleaning the wound and applying pressure bandages, while Tom held his grandmother steady. "I didn't know where else to go," Tom gasped, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Everything else is gone or falling apart. Your place, it's the only thing still standing." Maya felt a complex mix of vindication and sorrow. She'd been right about the conventional building methods, but being right meant watching her neighbors lose everything. How many others are trapped out there? "I don't know." The Hendersons made it to the community center before their roof went, but that was hours ago. I haven't seen anyone else since Grandma's house came down. Tom's hands shook as he helped adjust his grandmother's position. "Maya, I owe you an apology. We all do. We thought you were crazy, building this weird place, but—" "Save it," Maya interrupted, though not unkindly. "We need to focus on survival right now." She moved to her emergency supplies, pulling out additional medical materials. Mrs. Chen was stable for now, but she needed proper medical attention. Unfortunately, with the roads impassable and the storm still raging, they were on their own. The shelter shuddered as something massive struck it, probably a tree or piece of debris from one of the destroyed homes. Maya felt the walls flex and redistribute the impact force through the interconnected framework. Any rigid structure would have cracked under that blow, but her design absorbed and dissipated the energy like a leaf bending in the wind. "Jesus," Tom whispered, his eyes wide with renewed fear. "What was that?" "Just the storm testing us," Maya replied, checking the structural integrity with practiced eyes. Everything still looked solid. "We're going to be okay." But even as she spoke those reassuring words, Maya knew the worst was yet to come. According to the last weather report, they were still in the outer bands of the storm. The eye wall, where the most devastating winds would be, wasn't expected to reach them for another 2 hours. Mrs. Chen stirred, mumbling something in Cantonese that Tom seemed to understand. He leaned close to his grandmother, speaking softly in the same language. When he looked up at Maya, tears were streaming down his face. The wind howled like a living thing as Maya pressed herself against the stone wall of her shelter, feeling the mountain tremble beneath the storm's fury. Through the narrow window she'd carved, she could see the chaos unfolding across Pine Ridge. Traditional houses swayed dangerously, their wooden frames groaning under the relentless assault. Several roofs had already torn away, spinning into the darkness like deadly projectiles. But her unconventional dwelling held firm. The interlocking stone technique she'd learned from her grandmother, dismissed by the townspeople as primitive and impractical, was proving its worth against nature's wrath. Each carefully placed rock distributed the wind's force, creating a structure that bent without breaking. A thunderous crack split the night. Maya watched in horror as the Hendersons' 2-story colonial tilted precariously, its foundation buckling. Through their illuminated windows, she could see figures moving frantically inside. The house wouldn't last another hour. She grabbed her emergency pack and pushed against the heavy wooden door. The wind nearly knocked her backward, but she fought through it, her boots finding purchase on the stone path she'd meticulously laid months earlier. While the town council had mocked her wasteful rock arrangements, the stable walkway now provided the only safe passage through the debris-filled storm. The journey to the Henderson house took 20 agonizing minutes. Maya battled through horizontal rain and dodged flying branches, her body battered by the elements. When she finally reached their front door, it was hanging by a single hinge. "Mr. Henderson!" she shouted over the roar. "Mrs. Henderson!" Tom Henderson appeared in the doorway, his face pale with terror. Behind him, his wife clutched their twin daughters, both girls crying hysterically. "Maya?" Tom's voice cracked with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Your house is failing," she yelled back. "You need to come with me now." Tom hesitated, glancing back at his home of 15 years. This place has weathered plenty of storms before. A violent shudder cut him off as another support beam splintered audibly. The ceiling above them sagged ominously. "Dad!" one of the twins screamed. That broke his paralysis. "What do we do?" "Follow me. Stay low, stay together, and don't let go of the rope." Maya pulled a climbing rope from her pack, quickly fashioning a safety line. "My place will hold." They ventured into the maelstrom as a connected unit. Maya led, using her intimate knowledge of the mountain's contours to navigate the safest route. Twice they had to shelter behind her strategically placed windbreaks, stone formations the town planning committee had tried to force her to remove, calling them eyesores. The return journey stretched into an eternity. Young Katie Henderson stumbled, nearly swept away by a powerful gust, but the rope system held. Maya's months of solitary preparation, every ridiculed precaution she'd taken, now meant the difference between salvation and catastrophe. When they finally reached her shelter, the contrast was startling. While chaos reigned outside, the interior remained remarkably stable. The Henderson family huddled together, amazed by the sturdy walls and the absence of the terrifying creaking that had plagued their final hours at home. "I don't understand," Mrs. Henderson whispered, running her hands along the smooth stone surface. "How is this possible? Everyone said your methods were backwards." Maya was already preparing to leave again. Through her window, she could see other houses in distress. The Morrison place was losing shingles by the dozen, and old Joe Martinez's cabin looked ready to collapse entirely. "You're going back out there?" Tom grabbed her arm. "It's suicide." "These walls will protect you, but I won't sit here while neighbors die." Maya gently pulled free. "There's food in the back corner, and the water system will hold even if the power fails. Make yourselves comfortable." She disappeared back into the storm before they could protest further. The next several hours blurred together in a nightmare of rescue operations. Maya moved through Pine Ridge like a guardian spirit, using her network of sheltered paths and reinforced positions to reach family after family. The Morrisons, the elderly Patel couple, young Marcus Webb and his pregnant wife, one by one she guided them through the devastation to safety. Her small stone dwelling, designed for solitude, now housed nearly 20 people. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth and finding strength in their shared survival. Children who had once thrown rocks at her weird house now marveled at its protective embrace. As dawn approached and the storm's fury finally began to subside, Maya stood exhausted in her doorway, surveying the damage. Most of Pine Ridge lay in ruins. Roofs scattered, walls collapsed, the modern infrastructure that the community had prided itself on reduced to splinters and debris. But lives had been saved. Her grandmother's ancient knowledge, carried forward through generations of supposed foolishness, had proven more valuable than all the modern engineering in the valley. The greatest wisdom, Maya reflected, often came from the most unexpected places. The wind had stopped screaming, but that only made the silence more terrifying. Maya pressed her face against the reinforced window of the community center, watching debris tumble through the grey dawn like deadly confetti. Behind her, the building groaned under the storm's relentless assault, but Kai's radical support beams held firm. "How long has it been quiet?" whispered Mrs. Chen, clutching her grandson close. 20 minutes, Maya replied, not moving from the window. She'd learned enough about mountain weather to know this wasn't over. The eye of the storm was passing through, giving them a brief reprieve before the back wall hit with renewed fury. Kai emerged from the basement, his clothes torn and face streaked with dirt and sweat. "The foundation is holding better than I hoped. The underground anchor system is distributing the load perfectly." He paused, studying the faces around him. "But we're about to get hit from the opposite direction. The back half of these storms can be even worse." Mayor Davidson, who had spent the night alternating between pacing and praying, stepped forward. "What about the other buildings? Can we get a team out there to check on people?" "Absolutely not." The firmness in Kai's voice surprised everyone. "We have maybe 30 minutes before the winds return. Anyone caught outside when that happens won't survive." As if summoned by his words, a crackling voice emerged from Davidson's emergency radio. "Community Center, this is Sheriff Martinez at the school. We've got structural damage on the east wall. Part of the roof is gone. We need help." Maya's heart clenched. The school was where most of the families with young children had taken shelter. She grabbed the radio from Davidson's hands. "How many people? How bad is the damage?" 43 people, including 15 kids under 10. "The east wall is bowing inward. We've moved everyone to the west side, but I don't think it'll hold through another assault like the last one." Kai was already moving, grabbing tools from his emergency kit. "I can get there and back if I move fast. The school's foundation can be reinforced from the inside if I can redirect the load-bearing stress." "You can't go out there." Maya caught his arm. "You said it yourself. Anyone caught outside won't survive. Those kids won't survive if that building collapses." He gently pulled free from her grip. "I've studied the storm patterns. I know exactly where to run for cover when the winds return." Davidson shook his head. "Son, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't let you commit suicide. We'll figure out another way." "There is no other way." Kai shouldered his tool bag and headed for the door. "Maya's right about one thing. In 15 minutes, this becomes impossible. But right now, it's just dangerous." Maya watched him checking his equipment with methodical precision, the same way he'd approached every aspect of his building techniques. She realized that his strange methods weren't just about construction. They were about seeing solutions where others saw only problems. "I'm going with you," she announced. "Maya, no. You don't have the engineering knowledge to help, and you'll slow me down." "I have something better than engineering knowledge. I know every shortcut, every wind shelter, every safe path in this town." She grabbed her coat. "You need a guide, and I need to make sure you get back alive." The radio crackled again. "Community center. The wall is getting worse. I can hear the supports cracking." Kai met Maya's eyes, and she saw him calculating odds, weighing risks. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close and do exactly what I say. When I tell you to run, you run. When I tell you to drop, you drop." They stepped into the eerie calm together. The devastation was worse than Maya had imagined. Trees that had stood for decades were twisted into impossible shapes. The roof of Henderson's hardware store had been peeled back like a tin can. Cars were scattered across Main Street like toys. But Kai's buildings, the 3 structures he'd completed using his ridiculed techniques, stood virtually untouched. Their curved walls and flexible joints had bent with the wind instead of fighting it. "This way," Maya called, leading him through the maze of debris toward the school. They moved in controlled bursts, timing their runs between the gusting wind patterns that still swirled unpredictably through the mountain passes. The school came into view, and Maya's stomach dropped. The entire east wall was bulging outward, held in place by what looked like pure stubbornness. Through the broken windows, they could see people huddled against the far wall. 30 minutes, Kai muttered, studying the damage. "I can do this in 30 minutes." Maya felt the first stirrings of returning wind against her face and knew they were about to find out if the town's former outcast could work one more miracle. The wind had changed. Marcus felt it the moment he stepped outside the community center, a subtle shift in pressure that made his stomach clench. The storm was accelerating, and they were running out of time. "The northern ridge!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos as she sprinted toward him, her radio crackling with static. The weather station just went dark, but the last reading showed winds hitting 90 miles per hour up there. It's moving faster than predicted. Marcus wiped rain from his eyes, squinting toward the mountains where angry clouds boiled like smoke from a massive fire. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 6 hours before the worst of it hits the valley." 6 hours. Marcus's mind raced through calculations. They had barely finished reinforcing the school and the clinic. The residential areas were still vulnerable, and half the town remained skeptical of his methods despite the successful test structures. "We need more people," he said, watching another group of volunteers struggle with traditional sandbags that were already showing signs of strain. "And we need them to trust the process." As if summoned by his words, Eleanor Hartwell emerged from the community center, her silver hair whipping in the wind. Behind her followed a stream of people Marcus had never expected to see: the bank president, the hardware store owner, 3 members of the town council who had voted against his initial proposal. "Mr. Chen," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "We've had a change of heart. Some of us, anyway. What do you need?" The admission cost her something. Marcus could see it in the tight lines around her eyes. This was a woman who rarely admitted she was wrong, yet here she stood, offering her support in front of half the town. "Triangular supports," Marcus said without hesitation. "Every major structure needs them, and we need people who aren't afraid to build something that looks different from what they're used to." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Show us." The next 3 hours blurred together in a frenzy of activity. Marcus found himself running between construction sites, his voice hoarse from shouting instructions over the growing wind. The beauty of his design revealed itself in its simplicity. Once people understood the basic principles, they could adapt and improvise. At the Miller farmhouse, old Tom Miller worked alongside his grandson to create angled supports that would redirect the wind's force into the ground. At the edge of town, where the trailer park sat most vulnerable, residents used whatever materials they could find, car parts, furniture, even playground equipment, to build protective barriers based on Marcus's geometric patterns. But it was at the Morrison house that Marcus witnessed something that made him pause in wonder. Jenny Morrison, the young mother who had initially been his harshest critic, was directing a team of neighbors in constructing what could only be described as beautiful. They had taken his functional triangular design and somehow made it elegant, incorporating the natural curve of the hillside into a structure that looked almost organic. "You changed it," Marcus said, approaching Jenny as she adjusted a support beam. She looked up, defensive for a moment before she saw his expression. Was that wrong? It just seemed like the hill wanted to be part of the design, not fighting against it. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. "You understood something I missed." The sound of splintering wood interrupted them. Across the valley, one of the older structures, a barn that had stood for 50 years, was beginning to buckle under the wind. Marcus watched in dismay as its traditional frame twisted, unable to distribute the forces bearing down on it. "Will it hold?" Jenny asked, fear creeping into her voice. Marcus looked at their improvised structure, then at the test reading Sarah was calling out from her instruments. The numbers should have been impossible. Their makeshift barrier was withstanding forces that would have leveled a conventional building. "I think so," he said, then louder, with more conviction, "Yes, it'll hold." But even as he spoke, his attention was drawn to the horizon where the storm's full fury was finally revealing itself. What approached was beyond anything the models had predicted, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the mountains themselves. His radio crackled to life. "Marcus, "This is Sarah. You need to see this. The storm just jumped intensity categories. We're looking at sustained winds over 120 miles per hour." The volunteers around him had heard the transmission. He saw doubt creeping back into their faces, the fragile confidence they had built beginning to crack. "Listen to me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the construction sites. "What we've built here today, it's not just wood and metal and hope. It's a new way of thinking about strength. We bend so we don't break. We redirect instead of resisting. And we do it together." The storm answered with a roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The ancient timbers groaned like wounded giants as Marcus pressed his shoulder against the reinforcement beam, feeling the mountain's fury testing every joint he'd carefully crafted. Through the storm's howling, he could hear the rhythmic thudding of rocks and debris striking the outer walls, sounds that would have meant certain death in any conventionally built structure. But here, in the community center, he'd designed using techniques the town council had once mocked as primitive nonsense. The flexible framework absorbed each impact like a boxer rolling with punches. "The eastern wall is holding," Sarah's voice cut through the chaos as she emerged from checking the far corner where the Hendricks family huddled with their newborn. "Whatever you did to those joints, Marcus, it's working." Marcus wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the constant vibration traveling through the building's skeleton. Around him, 43 souls, nearly half the town's population, pressed together in the space he'd insisted on making larger than anyone thought necessary. Old Mrs. Chen clutched her grandson while whispering prayers in Mandarin. The Kowalski twins, normally impossible to quiet, sat in stunned silence as the storm raged overhead. Even Mayor Brennan, who had publicly called Marcus's construction methods an embarrassment to modern engineering, now watched with grudging respect as the unconventional structure weathered nature's assault. "We should have listened to you from the beginning," Elena Vasquez said, approaching with her young daughter clinging to her leg. As the town's head librarian, she'd been one of the few to support Marcus's radical approach when he'd first proposed it 6 months ago. When you tried to explain about earthquake engineering principles in landslide zones. "Don't." Marcus shook his head, checking another support beam. "What matters is that you're all safe now. The building is doing exactly what it was designed to do." A thunderous crack split the air, followed by an impact that sent vibrations through the floor. Marcus's heart hammered as he realized what had happened. Something massive had struck the roof, but instead of catastrophic collapse, the flexible framework distributed the load across multiple support points, exactly as he'd calculated. The ceiling sagged slightly in one corner but held firm. Young Tommy Morrison, barely 16 and apprenticed to the local carpenter, approached with obvious awe. "How did you know, Mr. Marcus? How did you know to build it this way when everyone said—" "Because I've seen what happens when people ignore nature instead of working with it." Marcus's voice carried the weight of memories from his childhood in earthquake country, of buildings that pancaked because they fought seismic forces instead of yielding to them. "My grandmother always said the reed that bends in the wind survives when the mighty oak breaks." Dr. Patel, the town's physician, looked up from treating a man who'd been injured while seeking shelter. "The emergency services radio is completely dead. We have no way of knowing when help might arrive, or even if—" He stopped himself, glancing toward the children. "Help will come," Marcus said firmly, though privately he wondered how long it might take for rescue teams to reach them through the devastated mountain passes. "This building can sustain us for days if necessary. I included emergency supply storage in the foundation design." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean when everyone complained about the wasteful basement space?" "Wasteful." Marcus almost smiled despite their circumstances. 15 people told me those storage areas were proof I didn't understand efficient design. Turns out efficiency isn't just about minimizing space, it's about maximizing survival. Another impact shook the building, but the familiar pattern of stress distribution reassured Marcus that his calculations were holding true. The interlocking timber frame, inspired by traditional Japanese earthquake-resistant architecture and adapted for landslide conditions, continued its deadly dance with the mountain's fury. As if reading his thoughts, Mayor Brennan approached, his face haggard but his eyes clear. "When this is over, Marcus, we need to talk about retrofitting every structure in town. I was wrong. The whole council was wrong." "When this is over," Marcus replied, watching a massive boulder roll past the window, "we'll rebuild properly, together." The storm continued its assault, but inside the ridiculed building that had become their ark, 43 people drew closer together and waited for dawn. In the darkness, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of vindication, not in being right, but in being useful when it mattered most. The morning brought an eerie calm that fooled no one. Maya stood at the window of the community center, watching the last families hurry toward the reinforced buildings scattered across town. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of destruction. Behind her, the emergency radio crackled with updates that grew more dire by the hour. "Category 4 winds confirmed," the meteorologist's voice cut through the static. "Complete structural failure expected for standard construction. This is now a life-threatening event." Elder Blackwood approached, his weathered face etched with worry. "The Peterson family is refusing to leave their farm. They say it's been in their family for 4 generations. Maya turned from the window. "Which building technique did they use?" "Standard frame construction. Post and beam." His voice carried the weight of understanding. "It won't survive." She grabbed her coat. "I'm going out there." "Maya, the outer bands are already hitting. It's not safe." But she was already pushing through the door into the howling wind. The storm's advance guard whipped her hair across her face as she fought her way to her truck. Tree branches bent at impossible angles, and loose debris skittered across the road like frightened animals. The Peterson farm sat 2 miles outside town, nestled in a valley that would become a wind tunnel once the storm's full fury arrived. Maya found the family huddled in their kitchen, stubbornly preparing what might be their last meal in the house their great-grandfather had built. "You have to come with me," Maya shouted over the growing roar outside. "Your house can't withstand what's coming." James Peterson, a man whose pride ran as deep as his roots, shook his head. "We've weathered storms before. This old place is solid." His wife Sarah clutched their 2 young children closer. Maya could see the fear in her eyes, the terrible conflict between loyalty and survival. "Please," Maya tried again. "I've run the calculations. The wind load will exceed your structure's capacity by 300%. The joints will fail." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous gust slammed into the house. The windows rattled violently, and somewhere upstairs, a door banged open and shut like a gunshot. The children whimpered. "Sarah," Maya said, addressing the mother directly, "remember what happened to the Morrison place 3 years ago? This will be worse." Sarah's resolve cracked first. She stood abruptly, pulling her children with her. "James, I won't risk them. I won't." The argument that followed was brief, but fierce. In the end, love trumped pride, as Maya had hoped it would. The Peterson family loaded into her truck just as the storm's intensity doubled, transforming the world outside into a chaos of horizontal rain and flying debris. The drive back to town became a nightmare navigation exercise. Maya's truck bucked and swayed against wind gusts that seemed determined to lift them off the road entirely. Twice she had to stop and wait for downed power lines to be cleared by emergency crews who worked with desperate efficiency. Mrs. Chen's old Victorian lost its wraparound porch in a single catastrophic moment, the decorative woodwork exploding into deadly projectiles. The gas station's canopy twisted and collapsed, its metal supports no match for the relentless wind. But the buildings Maya had worked on, the ones the town had initially mocked, held firm. Inside the community center, nearly 200 people had taken shelter. The building groaned and shuddered under the storm's assault, but Maya's reinforcement techniques were proving their worth. The deep foundations she'd insisted on kept them anchored, The steel cables she'd run through the walls distributed the massive loads across the entire structure. Even the unusual bracing pattern in the roof, which had drawn so much criticism, was working exactly as she'd designed it to. Dr. Harrison found her checking stress points along the main support beam. "The radio says we're only halfway through," he said. "Peak winds won't hit for another 4 hours." Maya nodded, running her hand along a joint that showed slight movement but remained solid. "We'll make it. The question is what we'll find outside when this is over." Through the reinforced windows, they watched the storm claim more victims. The old church steeple snapped like a twig. A mobile home tumbled past like a child's toy, but the buildings Maya had touched, the ones built with her ridiculed techniques, continued to stand. As the wind reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very earth, Maya realized that tomorrow would bring more than just cleanup and rebuilding. It would bring a fundamental shift in how this community saw both her and the wisdom she'd tried to share, if they all lived to see tomorrow. The wind had teeth now, sinking into every exposed surface with vicious intent. Maya pressed her back against the reinforced wall of her shelter, feeling the structure flex, but hold as another gust hammered against it. Through the narrow window, she could see the chaos unfolding across Millbrook Valley. The traditional houses were failing one by one. The Peterson farmhouse, built with conventional methods that had served the valley for generations, groaned under the assault before its roof peeled away like paper. She watched helplessly as the family's belongings scattered into the howling darkness. The general store's windows had already blown out, and its walls swayed dangerously with each fresh onslaught. Tom's voice cut through the storm as he stumbled against her door, supporting Mrs. Chen, who was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Behind them came a stream of refugees, the Hendersons, old Mr. Pike, the Martinez family with their 3 young children. The community center's roof caved in. "We need shelter." She threw open the door, her experimental construction technique finally facing its ultimate test. 23 people crowded into a space designed for one, but the interlocking support beams she'd developed held firm. Her radical approach to weight distribution, mocked by every contractor in the valley, was proving its worth when conventional wisdom crumbled. "How is this even possible?" Sarah Henderson whispered, staring up at the ceiling as another tremendous gust shook the building. The walls flexed inward, then sprang back to their original position. "This place should have collapsed before our house." Maya moved through the cramped space, checking the stress points she'd built into the structure. The flexible joints were absorbing the wind's energy instead of fighting it, while the deep foundation anchors she'd insisted upon kept everything grounded. Every element that had earned her ridicule was now saving lives. "The storm's getting worse," Tom reported, peering through the reinforced window. "I can see the river overflowing. The bridge is completely underwater." Through the howling wind, they could hear the destruction spreading. The crash of falling trees, the grinding of metal being twisted beyond recognition, the desperate calls of people still trapped in failing structures. Maya's radio crackled with emergency reports from the surrounding counties. This storm was breaking records that had stood for over a century. Little Emma Martinez started crying, overwhelmed by the noise and chaos. Her mother pulled her close, but the child's fear was contagious. Other families huddled together, watching the walls around them with growing anxiety despite their strength. "Tell us about the house," Mrs. Chen said quietly, trying to distract the children. "How did you know to build it this way?" Maya settled against one of her signature support posts, feeling its steady pulse as it absorbed each impact. "My grandfather was an engineer in Japan. He survived earthquakes that destroyed everything around him, and he taught me that sometimes you have to bend to avoid breaking. When I came here, everyone said I was building wrong, that I didn't understand mountain weather." "We were idiots," Tom muttered, shame evident in his voice. "Complete idiots." Another massive gust struck, this one strong enough to lift debris and hurl it against the walls. The impact sounded like cannon fire, but Maya's structure absorbed it all. The flexible framework distributed the force throughout the building, while the specialized foundation she'd designed prevented any shifting or settling. "The wind speed has to be over 100 miles per hour now," Dr. Williams observed, checking his emergency weather radio. "The meteorologists are calling it unprecedented. A perfect storm of conditions that shouldn't exist in this region." Maya moved to the window, watching her neighbors' lives being dismantled by forces beyond human control. Every family in this room had dismissed her methods, questioned her competence, suggested she didn't belong in their mountain community. Now their survival depended entirely on the techniques they'd ridiculed. But she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. Only a deep sadness for the destruction outside and determination to see everyone through the night. "There's another family out there," she said suddenly, spotting movement near the collapsed general store. "Someone's trapped in the debris." Maya was already reaching for her emergency gear. "The building will hold without me. It's designed to. Then we go together," he said firmly. "All of us who can manage it." She looked around the room at faces that had shown her nothing but skepticism for months. Now they watched her with trust, waiting for her guidance. These people had finally learned to listen to the outsider they'd called foolish. "Stay with the children," she told the parents. "Everyone else, we move fast and we move smart. This storm isn't finished with us yet." The wind screamed its fury as they prepared to venture back into the teeth of the tempest. The wind had grown teeth overnight, snarling through the gaps in Maya's reinforced structures with a fury that made the previous days seem like gentle warnings. She pressed her face against the small window of the community center, watching debris spiral past in patterns that defied physics. Trees that had stood for decades bent at impossible angles, their roots clawing desperately at soil that was rapidly turning to mud. "The eastern slope is starting to give way," called Tom from across the room, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. He'd been monitoring the radio all night, coordinating with the few remaining outposts still able to communicate. Henderson's Ridge just lost 3 houses to a landslide. Maya's stomach clenched. Henderson's Ridge was only 2 miles away, built on similar terrain with the same conventional foundations that had once been the pride of mountain construction. She turned from the window to survey the packed shelter. Nearly 200 people filled every available space, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Children huddled against their parents, while elderly residents sat quietly, their weathered hands clasped in prayer or worry. "How are we holding up?" asked Dr. Sarah Chen, appearing at Maya's elbow with dark circles under her eyes. She'd been treating injuries and managing the medical needs of the evacuees since the storm began its assault. "The supports are flexing exactly as designed," Maya replied, running her hand along one of the curved wooden braces that formed the backbone of her emergency reinforcement system. "The building is moving with the wind instead of fighting it, but I won't lie, this is beyond anything I tested." A tremendous crash echoed from somewhere outside, followed by screams from several people near the windows. Maya rushed over to see the twisted remains of a pickup truck tumbling past, swept along by a wall of water and debris that had once been Maple Street. The storm had found every weakness in the town's drainage system and exploited it ruthlessly. "Maya!" The voice belonged to James Morrison, one of the few town council members who had initially opposed her methods most vocally. He pushed through the crowd with surprising urgency, his usual pompous demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "The old Morrison house. My family built it in 1953, solid as a rock, they said. It's gone, just gone, washed away like it was made of paper." She watched him struggle with the implications, his entire worldview crumbling along with the structures he'd believed were unshakable. "James, I'm sorry, but your family is safe. That's what matters now." "How did you know?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "How did you know our way was wrong?" Before Maya could answer, young Timothy Chen came running from the radio station they'd set up in the corner. "Maya! There's a group trapped in the old mining office building, about 30 people. The road washed out and they can't get here. The building's starting to flood, and they're saying the foundation is cracking." Maya closed her eyes, her mind racing through possibilities. The mining office was one of the oldest structures in town, built with methods that predated even the conventional wisdom she'd been fighting against. In this storm, it would be a death trap. "How long before we lose communication with them?" she asked. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky," Timothy replied. "The radio tower is swaying pretty badly." Maya looked around the shelter, taking in the faces that had become familiar over the past months. These people had trusted her with their lives, even when she was just the strange outsider with crazy ideas about flexible architecture. Now she had to make an impossible choice. "I need to go to them," she said quietly. "Absolutely not," Dr. Chen said immediately. "It's suicide out there." "Maya, you can't save everyone," added Tom, overhearing the conversation. "You've already done more than anyone could have asked." But Maya was already moving toward her emergency kit, checking the portable reinforcement materials she'd prepared for exactly this kind of situation. They were lightweight versions of her larger designs, meant to be rapidly deployed in crisis situations. She'd hoped never to need them. "The people here are safe because of the choices we made together," she said, turning to address the small group that had gathered around her. "But those people over there are going to die because they didn't have the same chance. I can't live with that." Morrison stepped forward unexpectedly. "Then you won't go alone. I may not understand your methods, but I understand debt. This whole town owes you more than we can ever repay. James, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "Besides, I know those old mining tunnels better than anyone. If we're going to reach them, we'll need to go underground." Maya felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The mining tunnels might provide shelter from the worst of the storm, but they'd also be flooding. It would be a race against time and rising water, with 30 lives hanging in the balance. The mountain's fury had reached its crescendo. Through the reinforced windows of Maya's shelter, the survivors watched in horrified fascination as century-old pines snapped like matchsticks and boulders the size of cars tumbled down the slopes like children's toys. The wind had become a living thing, screaming with voices that seemed almost human in their anguish. "Jesus Christ," whispered Tom Brennan, pressing his face against the thick glass. The man who had once called Maya's construction methods architectural suicide now stood in the very building that was keeping him alive. Outside, his own cabin, built to every code and regulation, had vanished completely, swept away in the first hour of the storm's assault. Maya moved through the shelter with quiet efficiency, checking the structural sensors she had installed throughout the building. The numbers on her tablet told a story that would have terrified any conventional engineer. The winds were sustaining speeds of over 200 miles per hour, with gusts reaching nearly 250. The seismic activity from the landslides was registering as a continuous earthquake, yet her building held. "The eastern wall is flexing perfectly," she announced to the 37 people crowded into the main space. "We're getting about 18 inches of movement at the peak, well within tolerance." Dr. Elizabeth Carver, the town's physician, looked up from where she was tending to young Sarah Hoffman's broken arm. 18 inches? Shouldn't we be concerned about that?" Maya smiled, remembering the skeptical faces at the town planning meetings, the rolled eyes when she had explained her theories. "Rigid structures break, Dr. Carver. Flexible ones bend and survive. The human body taught me that. Bones break, but cartilage endures." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, themselves a marvel of engineering that had drawn ridicule for their apparent vulnerability, they could see the old community center collapsing in slow motion. The pride of Millbrook, built with federal funds and engineered to withstand anything nature could throw at it, folded like wet cardboard under the storm's relentless pressure. Sarah's father, Jim Hoffman, stood transfixed by the destruction. His hardware store was gone, along with the inventory that represented 3 generations of his family's work. But his daughter was alive. Her arm would heal, and that was what mattered now. "Maya," he called out, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. Hell, we all do." The young woman looked up from her tablet, her dark hair falling across her face. At 2006, she had endured 2 years of mockery and bureaucratic obstruction to build this shelter. The town council had tried to stop her, calling her methods unproven and dangerous. Only the intervention of old Judge Martinez, citing some obscure property rights law, had allowed her to proceed. No apologies needed, Mr. Hoffman. You were protecting your community the only way you knew how. But even as she spoke, Maya's attention was divided. The tablet in her hands was showing something that made her stomach clench with worry. The storm was shifting, its eye wall beginning to wobble in a pattern she recognized from her doctoral research on extreme weather systems. They weren't at the worst part yet. Father O'Malley was leading a group in quiet prayer near the eastern wall, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. The elderly priest had been one of Maya's harshest critics, calling her shelter an affront to God's natural order. Now he prayed in its protection, his weathered hands clasped around a rosary worn smooth by decades of use. Maya's earpiece crackled with static, then cleared enough for her to hear the voice of Commander Walsh from the Emergency Coordination Center in the valley. "Millbrook Shelter, this is Base. Do you copy?" She keyed her microphone. "Base, this is Maya Chen at Millbrook. We copy." "Maya, we're tracking the storm system. The eye wall is about to pass over your position. You're going to get a break in the winds for maybe 20 minutes, then the back wall hits. The computer models are showing wind speeds that..." His voice faded into static. "Base, say again. What are the projectids?" The response, when it came through, sent ice through her veins. 270 plus, Maya, maybe 300. We've never seen anything like this. Can your structure handle those loads? Maya looked around at the faces turned toward her, at the children sleeping in their parents' arms, at the elderly couples holding each other close. These people had trusted her design with their lives, even those who had fought against it. "We're about to find out, Base. We're about to find out." The mountain shuddered beneath Maya's feet as she pressed her back against the reinforced wall of her workshop. Outside, the storm had become something beyond nature, a writhing, screaming monster that seemed intent on erasing Pine Ridge from existence entirely. Through the small window, she could barely make out the shapes of buildings through the horizontal sheets of rain and debris, but her walls held. The interlocking timber framework she'd spent months perfecting absorbed each gust, each impact, distributing the forces through the entire structure rather than concentrating them at weak points. What the town council had mocked as primitive stick-weaving was proving more resilient than any conventional construction they'd ever seen. A thunderous crack split the air, followed by screams. Maya grabbed her emergency radio and struggled to raise anyone on the emergency frequency. Static filled the airwaves until finally Sheriff Morrison's voice broke through. "Maya, thank God. Half the town's been evacuated to the school, but the gymnasium roof just collapsed. We've got 40 people trapped in the basement and water's rising fast." She closed her eyes, calculating. The school sat in Pine Ridge's lowest valley, a natural collection point for runoff. In a storm of this magnitude, it would become a death trap within hours. "The community center," Maya said into the radio. "It's on higher ground and I reinforced the main hall last month. Can you get people there? The bridge is out. We can't cross Eagle Creek with the buses. What about the old logging road? Washed out 3 hours ago." She grabbed her coat and emergency pack. "I'm going to the creek. There might be another way." "Maya, don't be crazy. You can't." She switched off the radio and plunged into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her flat before she'd taken 3 steps. Debris whirled through the air, roof shingles, tree branches, pieces of siding that had been torn from buildings. She kept her head down and fought her way toward the sound of rushing water. Eagle Creek had transformed from a modest mountain stream into a raging torrent 20 feet across. Brown water churned with uprooted trees and the wreckage of anything the storm had claimed upstream. The steel bridge hung at a twisted angle, its support cables snapped, the roadway buckled and impassable. But Maya wasn't looking at the bridge. She was studying the creek bed itself, measuring distances and angles with an engineer's eye. On both sides, massive pine trees still stood, their root systems anchored deep in bedrock. If she could span the gap between them. She fought her way back to her workshop, gathering every piece of flexible timber she'd prepared for future projects. The wood was green and strong, designed to bend rather than break. Working with desperate efficiency, she began weaving the pieces together, creating a flexible span that could accommodate the violent motion of the storm. The work was brutal. Every few minutes, she had to shelter against the workshop wall as particularly vicious gusts threatened to tear her construction apart before it was complete. Her hands bled from handling the rough timber, and rain drove into her eyes until she could barely see. But the technique held. Just as she'd learned from studying traditional suspension bridges built by indigenous communities, the flexible framework distributed stress across the entire structure. Instead of fighting the storm's forces, it moved with them. After 2 hours, she had 20 feet of woven timber walkway. She dragged it to the creek, now raging even higher than before. Several times the structure nearly escaped her grip, caught by wind gusts that tried to tear it from her hands. Securing one end to the massive pine on her side took another 30 minutes of dangerous work, climbing the swaying tree while the storm tried to shake her loose. Getting the other end across the torrent seemed impossible until she remembered the compound bow she'd seen in the sporting goods store. The arrow, weighted with paracord, arced across the gap on her third attempt. Once she had a line established, she could work the timber framework across, piece by piece, until the far end could be secured to the opposite tree. The finished bridge swayed sickeningly in the wind, its timber deck rising and falling like a living thing, but it held. Maya keyed her radio. "Sheriff Morrison, I've got a footbridge across Eagle Creek. It's not much, but people can cross single file." A long pause. "Then Maya, you might have just saved 40 lives." As the first group of evacuees appeared through the storm, moving carefully across her impossible bridge, Maya allowed herself one moment of fierce satisfaction. The wisdom her grandmother had shared about working with nature instead of against it had proven stronger than any conventional engineering the town had ever known. The dawn broke through dissipating clouds, casting golden light across what remained of Millbrook. Maya stood on the porch of her reinforced cabin, watching the townspeople emerge from buildings throughout the valley. Her structure had weathered the storm's fury without a single crack in its foundation, its flexible joints and deep anchoring system having absorbed the mountain's violent tremors while the winds screamed overhead. But she wasn't looking at her own success. Her eyes were fixed on the cluster of buildings near the town center, where families were stepping out into the morning air, alive and whole. The community center, the school, Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, the clinic, all standing strong, their hastily retrofitted foundations and reinforced frames having held against forces that should have reduced them to splinters. Sarah's voice carried across the debris-strewn streets. The town councilwoman was picking her way through fallen trees and scattered roofing materials, her face streaked with exhaustion, but glowing with something Maya had never seen there before: genuine respect. Behind Sarah came others. Tom Fletcher, his arm in a makeshift sling but his weathered face bright with gratitude. The Kowalski family, all 5 children chattering excitedly as they surveyed their intact home. Even Harold Grimsby, who had been the most vocal opponent of Maya's foolish methods, approached with his hat literally in his hands. "We owe you an apology," Sarah said when she reached the porch. "More than an apology. We owe you our lives." Maya descended the steps slowly, her boots crunching on pine needles and broken glass. Around them, the mountain bore the scars of the storm's passage: massive trees uprooted, rock slides that had carved new channels down the slopes, a landscape transformed by forces beyond human control. Yet here in the heart of Millbrook, life continued. "You don't owe me anything," Maya replied, though her voice carried a weight of emotion she couldn't quite suppress. "You did the work. You trusted the process when it mattered most." Tom Fletcher stepped forward, gesturing toward his house, where his elderly mother was tending to flowers in window boxes that had somehow survived the chaos. The old foundation would have given way in the first hour. The whole place would have pancaked with Mother inside. His voice cracked slightly. "That new anchoring system of yours, It's like the building was dancing with the earthquake instead of fighting it. Maya nodded, remembering those frantic weeks when half the town had called her methods wasteful and strange. The flexible joint systems that allowed structures to sway without breaking. The deep foundation anchors that worked with the mountain's geology rather than against it. The reinforcement patterns, inspired by how trees survived storms by bending rather than standing rigid. The mountain teaches patience, she said, words her grandfather had spoken to her years ago when she was just learning to read the land's subtle language. But it also teaches adaptation. Everything here learns to flex, or it breaks. Dr. Elizabeth Chen emerged from the clinic, supporting an elderly man with a bandaged head. Even the medical facility had held together, its reinforced walls and secured equipment having protected most vulnerable during the worst of the storm. She caught Maya's eye and mouthed a silent thank you before helping her patient toward one of the intact houses. Harold Grimsby cleared his throat awkwardly. "I was wrong about you, miss. Dead wrong." He gestured toward the section of town that hadn't received Maya's improvements in time, a sobering landscape of collapsed roofs and broken walls. The old Miller place, the original town hall, 3 houses on Elm Street, all gone. Built the same way my grandfather built, the way his grandfather built. Thought that made it right. "Tradition has its place," Maya said gently. "But mountains don't care about tradition. They only care about what works." As the day progressed, the full scope of both destruction and survival became clear. The buildings that had been retrofitted with Maya's techniques stood like islands of stability in a sea of debris. More importantly, not a single life had been lost in the structures that had received her improvements. Families were reunited, neighbors helped neighbors clear fallen branches from doorways, and children played in yards that should have been buried under collapsed homes. Mayor Patricia Wells arrived by helicopter that afternoon, her face grim as she surveyed the damage from above before landing in the town square. But when she saw the extent of the survival in the retrofitted areas, her expression shifted to amazement. "How many casualties?" she asked Sarah, clearly preparing for the worst. 7 injuries, all minor. No fatalities in the reinforced structures, Sarah reported. Maya's methods, they worked exactly as she said they would. The mayor turned to Maya, studying the young woman who had been dismissed as an outsider just months before. "I think it's time we talked about expanding this approach to other mountain communities. Will you help us?" Maya looked around at the faces surrounding her, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive, but open and grateful. She had found her home among people who had finally learned to listen to the mountain's wisdom. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll help.